There was an article this morning that came out in the Hollywood Reporter that I think flew under the radar. And I'd read it, and then I wanted to digest it and then come back to it later in the day. The title of the article is, "When Filmmakers Ignore the Political Right, Is That Financially Wrong?" Conservative creatives say the industry is, quote, leaving a giant pile of money on the table by neglecting Trump supporters and other right-leaning moviegoers. Well, I think their definition of right-leaning includes anyone who is a centrist, or at least would have been a centrist before, say, last election. The article, of course, maintained the same narrative put out by Disney over Gina Carano, and it referenced the February 21st episode of The Ben Shapiro Show when she spoke with Ben about their upcoming collaboration. Now, this article happened to cherry pick one bit of dialogue between Gina and Ben Shapiro, and that was her liking the movie Drive. To quote Gina Carano, "I'm a big fan of the movie Drive with Ryan Gosling," unquote, the actress said when asked what she is looking to make. I'd call that a hint. Quote, "I've been a little underutilized in Hollywood," unquote. And the article, of course, has to do some type of backhanded virtue signal by calling the movie Drive uber violent, and that it somehow might be an odd template for the right-wing distributor which plans to make films that espouse conservative values. It just, they don't stop. My narrative. You know, Gina Carano is an action movie star. Doing an action movie that has violence? How is this a surprise? And they go on to say anyone who likes Gina Carano is, quote, the anti-woke crowd. If by anti-woke you mean we don't like corporations that abuse women, that are strong, independent, free-thinking women who say something that differs from their politics and then is fired for it over the internet while being, in my opinion, slandered, yeah, we're anti-woke. I find this article interesting and that it is finally starting to echo what a lot of very large YouTube channels such as Doomcock, Geeks and Gamers, Nerdrotic have all talked about. That anybody who actually makes quality content that doesn't possess this incredibly left-leaning, intersectionalist, hyper-woke agenda and just concentrates on making a good story is gonna clean up. I mean, honestly, at this point, if somebody actually made Black Beauty or Old Yeller or something, some classical piece of literature with, maybe positive affirmation of values that are native to this country, I think they would clean up. So this article goes on to point out the perfectly obvious for those of you who are not incredibly left-leaning, those of you like myself who consider themselves maybe a centrist or a classical liberal, that the more than 70 million Americans that voted for Donald Trump and potentially other independent candidates in the election last year, we're looking at a Hollywood content that there's very little that interests us. There's very little that appeals to us. And the article says that leaves a big opening for those willing to risk ostracization from the rest of the industry. Oh no. So you won't get invited to Brie Larson's house to do yoga or go to a crappy Kathleen Kennedy Locust film opening. Oh boo-hoo. The article talks about Amanda Milius, who happens to be John Milius's daughter. Now, who's John Milius? He happens to be the screenwriter of Apocalypse Now and directed and wrote a series of wonderful movies out there that are among my favorites. So Amanda Milius went on to say in the article, if Hollywood is going to make an ideological business decision not to produce content that the majority of America wants to see, I don't have a problem with that. Because they're going to leave a giant pile of money on the table and my company has no problem taking it, unquote. You may remember Amanda Milius for her documentary called The Plot Against the President, which came out in 2020 and talks about what was then going on with their narrative surrounding President Trump and interference in a foreign country at that time. She talks about how she was very pleasantly surprised by the huge, her quote, DVD pre-sales and an unexpected large market for her film in Japan. To continue, Amanda Milia says, I was like, oh, it's 2020. Who cares about DVDs? But apparently, this audience likes to have the physical movie because they don't trust it will be available online. Unquote. She continues, Japan is obsessed with Trump, and it's a huge audience for us because they're really pissed off about China. Now, obviously, that is rooted in a very long, complicated history between those two countries. Milius's Washington-based production company, 1AMDC, is planning 8 to 5 movies over the next 3 years, starting with a documentary on China and censorship. Oh, hell yeah. Meanwhile, there is Roe v. Wade, a movie by Nick Loeb, which is coming out on April 2nd, and it will be on Amazon, iTunes, and pay-per-view. And it takes a critical look at what the article calls the reproductive rights advocate Margaret Sanger. I encourage you to look at a actual, say, books written 10, 20 years ago indicating the origin of where that particular individual came from, who she associated with, and why she advocated and set up the things that she did, and that's all I'm going to say. The cast of that movie includes Jon Voight and Stacey Dash. Interestingly enough, Stacey Dash was busy apologizing in yet another article that was out there on The Hollywood Reporter, but I'm not going to get into that. And what did she apologize for? Well, of course, it's Hollywood 2021. It's for who she voted for, and apparently she was not, quote, on the right side of history, unquote. It goes on to quote Loeb, who has a famous Hollywood ex that I'm not going to talk about here, but he says, you can be a conservative in Hollywood, and you can be a Republican, and people don't have a problem. There's only 2 things you cannot be in Hollywood, pro-Trump and pro-life, says Loeb's, and that he is both. So this brings us to the meat of why I decided to post this. The article describes how directors like Amanda Milius expect the large streaming services to resist their content. Why? Not because of the quality, but because of the culture, worldview, and politics that it encompasses. So if it doesn't match up with the narrative, with the agenda, with the politics that Hollywood is currently pushing, of course Amazon isn't going to show it. The Hollywood Reporter calls this right-leaning content. And it talks about how in February of this year, Amazon inexplicably decided to stop hosting all documentaries and shorts on its Prime Video Direct service. So no content from the Daily Wire is being allowed on Amazon Prime. Can you think of any reason why other than the obvious one? The article says, one top agent indicates that the move is bad for everyone and a sign that Amazon will likely implement a more, quote, curated strategy, unquote. Curated content strategy or censorship, exclusion based on political opinions, whatever. Let's get back to the article before I get in trouble with Mama Susan. So the article wraps up with, again, quoting Amanda Milius, quote, we broke their algorithms and showed up on everyone's front page as number 1. Amazon would rather kill the entire independent documentary industry than let that happen again, unquote. I don't think she's wrong. I think what this article shows us is undeniably the market that is out there, undeniably the audience that exists for just entertainment, classics, things that reflect, say, middle of the road views, classical liberal views, non-globalist views. Maybe just good stories. Just a good story without an agenda. I have to agree with Amanda Milius. There is a pile of money to be made by people whose number one concern is the quality of the story and fan service rather than agenda and narrative. I'm Corey B., and this is Salty Salish C.